USS Iowa was no ordinary ship. Born from the strategic imperatives of the 1930s and built during World War II, the Iowa-class battleships were engineered to counter formidable adversaries and ensure dominance on the high seas. These ships were marvels of engineering, a blend of raw power, advanced technology, and the weight of national pride. With 9 16-inch, 50-caliber Mark 7 guns housed in 3 towering turrets, each capable of independent operation, the Iowa was both a symbol and an instrument of American might. The turret itself was a labyrinth of activity. Imagine a space that extended through 4 to 5 floors below the main deck, a confined world where every movement had to be perfect, where even a fraction of a miscalculation could turn routine into catastrophe. The loading process was a dance of precision. Powder bags hoisted from below, projectiles selected in a separate chamber, and a mechanical rammer carefully pushing each charge into place. Every single action was timed to perfection. And yet, as we will see, that very precision would be betrayed on that fateful April morning. I remember thinking, as I researched this story, how often history reminds us that routine can be deceiving. On the morning of April 19, 1989, crews on the Iowa were following standard protocols. Turret 1 had fired its guns without incident, but a quiet unease was already in the air. There were murmurs of problems, a misfire here, a hesitancy there. Meanwhile, in Turret 2, the stage was being set for an experiment that would push the boundaries of standard operating procedure. For years, the Navy had been under immense pressure to deliver a modern, battle-ready fleet. Cost-cutting measures and rushed maintenance schedules had become the norm, and the Iowa was no exception. Captain Fred Musali, newly in command, had made several controversial decisions, canceling planned repairs on critical turret systems and reallocating funds to more immediate power plant issues. I want you to feel the tension here. A ship that was once the pride of the fleet was now operating with known faults, its crew undertrained, and its equipment slightly off balance. Enter the controversial experiment with D-846 powder, a propellant dating back to World War II. In an effort to improve the accuracy of the Iowa's guns, Master Chief Stephen Skelly proposed a radical change. Use fewer powder bag charges with this faster-burning powder in Turret 2's center gun. Instead of the usual 6 charges, he planned to use only 5 when firing the heavy 2,700-pound shells. This was no small deviation from procedure. It was a calculated risk that would prove to be fatally flawed. The crew prepared for the exercise on the evening of April 18th. Every detail was meticulously executed, or so it seemed. Turret crews conducted their final checks, and compressed air was blown down the barrels to clear any remnants of previous firings. But in Turret 2, the system that should have ensured safe loading and proper ramming of the charges was malfunctioning. The rammer, a device that was supposed to control the speed at which the powder bags were inserted, became the unwitting villain of our tale. It was known to operate at a delicate speed, 14 feet per second projectile, and a careful 1.5 feet per second for the fragile powder bags. Any deviation, even a slight overspeed, risked catastrophic friction and compression. And on that day, the margin for error was fatally exceeded. At precisely 9:33 a.m. on April 19, 1989, as Turret 1 fired smoothly, a misfortune was unfolding in Turret 2. The left and right guns were ready, but the center gun was showing signs of distress. Through the intercom, nervous voices attempted to coordinate the firing sequence. "Left gun loaded. Good job," someone said. But then, an ominous voice crackled over the speaker. "The center gun is having a little trouble." Moments later, panic surged as crew members heard the dreaded words, "Mort, Mort, Mort," before an explosion roared to life. I want you to picture this moment. 81 seconds after the order was given, the center gun exploded in a fireball so intense that it reached temperatures of 1,600 degrees centigrade. Debris from the open breach was hurled across multiple floors, and the very structure of the turret was compromised. Within seconds, chaos erupted. In that single explosion, 47 lives were lost. Men who had trusted their training, their leaders, and the very systems designed to protect them. And yet, as the smoke cleared, a deeper question began to emerge. How could a ship as mighty as the Iowa be brought low by what appeared to be a preventable error? Now I'm asking you, When something goes so terribly wrong, who truly is to blame? Is it the crew on the ground, who might have been inexperienced? Or is it a system that allowed a fatal deviation from standard protocol? I don't have all the answers, but I will take you on the journey to explore the many twists and turns that followed that tragic morning. Once the explosion subsided, heroic efforts were launched to extinguish the fire and recover the bodies of the fallen. Firefighting teams flooded the turret with water, drenching every surface, from the walls to the guns themselves. The grim task of body recovery and identification began immediately. In the chaos, some identities were lost in the shuffle. Bodies were rushed to various facilities for forensic examination, sometimes without proper documentation. Families waited agonized as the Navy scrambled to piece together what had happened. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the investigation into the disaster was taking shape. Initially, the Navy launched an internal inquiry, an informal investigation led by Commodore Richard Milligan. But what emerged from those early days was a murky web of suppressed evidence, conflicting testimonies, and decisions that would later seem less like efforts to uncover the truth and more like attempts to shift responsibility. As I dug deeper into this story, it became clear that the official narrative was riddled with contradictions. The initial Navy investigation dismissed the possibility of sabotage or external interference. Instead, it pointed the finger at a simple mechanical failure: the over-ramming of powder bags into the center gun. The report concluded that the 5 powder bags had been rammed 21 inches further than anticipated. Yet for many, this explanation was far too simplistic. How could a routine training exercise lead to such an overextension? And why, in the midst of rigorous protocol, did a single deviation set off such a deadly chain reaction? To add to the confusion, as more details emerged, the Navy's investigation began to look disturbingly like a cover-up. High-ranking officials were reluctant to admit that cost-cutting measures, combined with lax maintenance and the experimental use of outdated propellant, might have created a situation ripe for disaster. Instead, blame was subtly transferred onto the lower-ranking crew members, the very men who had been in the turret that day. In what some have called a victim-blaming narrative, the incompetence or inexperience of the turret's crew was held up as the root cause, diverting attention away from the systemic failures that had long plagued the ship. The investigations soon took a dark turn into personal territory. As families of the deceased demanded answers, the Navy's investigative team resorted to invasive and humiliating tactics. Crew members were interrogated for hours, pressured to make statements that would later be recanted. In one particularly disturbing episode, a sailor was forced into a lengthy interrogation, during which he was threatened with charges for multiple counts of murder. A pressure cooker scenario that led him to make, then retract, damning accusations against his superiors. It wasn't long before rumors of impropriety and personal vendettas began to circulate. Questions arose about why certain crew members were singled out, and why the investigation seemed more interested in assigning blame than in uncovering the full truth. I ask you now, when every piece of evidence points to systemic failures, why would the investigation focus on the actions of a few individuals? The unsettling answer may lie in the culture of the military itself, a culture where admitting error can be seen as a sign of weakness and where the chain of command is reluctant to accept that decisions made at the highest levels could have fatal consequences. It's crucial to understand the broader context. By the late 1980s, the Navy was under immense pressure to modernize its fleet while keeping costs under control. The Iowa, once a proud symbol of naval power, was aging. Maintenance schedules were cut short, and repair jobs were frequently delayed or canceled. On the day of the disaster, Captain Musali had just made a critical decision: cancel a $1 million repair job on the ship's 3 main turrets. Money was instead funneled toward power plant repairs, a choice that would come back to haunt the crew in Turret 2. This wasn't just an isolated decision. It was indicative of a system stretched too thin, where safety and precision were compromised by budget constraints and bureaucratic inertia. The decision to proceed with an experimental firing procedure, using an outdated powder that wasn't rated for the heavy 2,700-pound shells, was a gamble. And when that gamble went horribly wrong, the the repercussions were felt not in some abstract policy paper, but in the lives lost that morning. Even as the Navy's investigation wound down, questions remained. A final technical report, published in August 1991, concluded that no deliberate electronic or chemical timer was involved in the explosion. Instead, all signs pointed to an overramming error. Yet, how could an error of this magnitude occur under the watchful eyes of trained professionals? And why was it that, despite multiple tests and independent evaluations, the narrative kept shifting, first blaming a mechanical fault, then insinuating sabotage, and finally, placing the blame on the crew? I know you're wondering, what really happened in those final moments before the explosion? Were there warnings that went unheeded? Did the ship's design play a role in magnifying a small mistake into a fatal chain reaction? And most disturbingly, was this tragedy simply the inevitable outcome of a system designed to scapegoat those on the front lines? In the wake of the disaster, the families of the 47 men who perished were left with more questions than answers. Lawsuits were filed, not only against the Navy, but even against the media outlets that had propagated the official story. In a bizarre twist, the investigative process itself became mired in controversy. Testimonies were recanted, evidence was re-examined, and the true nature of responsibility remained as murky as ever. The case of Clayton Hartwick, one of the victims, became emblematic of this murkiness. His family's desperate bid for justice was met with institutional resistance and legal technicalities that effectively closed the case, leaving behind a bitter legacy of unanswered questions. The Navy eventually decommissioned the USS Iowa, sealing off the damaged turret and consigning it to history as a museum piece. But the story of that ill-fated morning continues to haunt naval circles and serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when systems fail and lives are sacrificed in the name of expediency. Now I need you to think with me for a moment. If you were standing on the deck of that battleship, knowing that every decision could mean life or death, not just for you, but for your brothers and sisters in arms, how would you react to being told that it was all just a mistake? What if the truth was deliberately obscured to save face at the highest levels of command? I challenge you to question what you hear and to look beyond the official statements. Sometimes the most chilling truths are hidden behind layers of red tape and self-preservation. In the end, the USS Iowa turret disaster remains one of the most perplexing and painful chapters in modern naval history. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, leadership, and the human cost of bureaucratic decisions. Was it a tragic accident, a mechanical error amplified by systemic neglect? Or was it a case of shifting blame, where those who suffered were made scapegoats for decisions made long before the fateful day? I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do know that this story demands our attention and reflection. As you leave this narrative, I want you to carry this thought with you. Sometimes, the real horror isn't in the explosion itself, but in the aftermath. The way truth is manipulated, and victims are forced to bear the blame for a tragedy that was never truly their fault. The USS Iowa's legacy is not just one of naval might and military history. It's also a stark lesson in the dangers of cutting corners, the perils of unquestioned authority, and the deep scars left when human life is sacrificed in the pursuit of a flawed ideal. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the Navy's darkest hours. I'm not just telling you a story, I'm inviting you to question, to reflect, and to never accept things at face value. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, never forget the cost of complacency. This is Freak Files channel that bring dark history and horror story to life via documentary. I love you guys, and remember, stay safe out there and keep seeking the truth.